Was there ever real evidence of Atlantis in Egypt? What if Atlantis wasn't searched for in the wrong ocean, but in the wrong place altogether? For more than 2,000 years, Atlantis has been imagined as a sunken island, lost beneath the sea, swallowed by waves, hidden somewhere in the Atlantic. That image is everywhere. But there's another idea, a quieter one, that keeps resurfacing in historical texts. What if the strongest clues connected to Atlantis are not underwater at all, but buried beneath the sands of Egypt? Tonight, we're not claiming Atlantis was in Egypt. We're asking a much simpler question. Was there ever anything real, anything specific, that caused serious historians and researchers to even consider the connection? And if there was, why is it still debated? Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This channel focuses on long, calm explorations of history. No rush. No forced conclusions. If that's something you enjoy, you're in the right place. Let's begin. Why Egypt keeps pulling Atlantis toward it. All right. Let's slow this down for a moment. Because before we ask whether Atlantis was real, or where it might have been, we need to answer a simpler question. Why does Egypt keep showing up in this story at all? Not just in ancient texts, but in modern theories, documentaries, and debates. Why Egypt? The story of Atlantis appears in exactly 2 ancient texts, Timaeus and Critias. They were written in the 4th century before the Common Era, by Plato. That alone already makes Atlantis unusual, because Plato was not collecting myths. He wasn't recording folklore. He wasn't writing epic poetry. He was a philosopher, someone deeply concerned with political systems, with how civilizations rise, and how they collapse. So when Atlantis appears in his work, it appears in a very deliberate context. Here's the detail that changes how the story is read. According to Plato, the story of Atlantis did not come from Greece. It came from Egypt. Specifically, from Egyptian priests, who shared it with the Athenian lawmaker Solon. That detail gets repeated often, but rarely examined. So let's examine it. In the ancient Greek world, Egypt was not seen as mysterious. It was seen as authoritative. Egypt was older than Greece. Its temples were older than Greek cities. Its priesthood was associated with record-keeping, not legend. To Greek thinkers, Egypt represented continuity, a place where history was stored, not just remembered. So when Plato anchors the Atlantis story in Egypt, he's doing something very specific. He's placing it inside the most credible historical archive his audience could imagine. That doesn't make the story true, but it explains why it felt serious. Now here's where things get interesting, and where most videos stop short. Nothing in ancient history becomes evidence on its own. Evidence is created by interpretation, and Egypt plays a powerful role in how interpretation works. Because Egypt isn't just a place, it's a symbol. For centuries, Egypt has functioned as a kind of historical anchor. When a story is connected to Egypt, it feels older, more stable, more trustworthy, even when physical proof is missing. This isn't unique to Atlantis. Lost wisdom, advanced knowledge, forgotten civilizations. Again and again, those ideas get projected onto Egypt. Not because Egypt confirms them, but because Egypt absorbs them. This is where Atlantis begins to shift. Not from history into fantasy, but from a single ancient account into a psychological pattern. Egypt becomes the container for what later cultures feel they've lost. And Atlantis fits perfectly inside that container. A great civilization. Advanced. Destroyed. The story feels like it belongs there, even when the evidence doesn't clearly place it there. Plato himself reinforces this effect. He claims Egypt preserved the Atlantis story because it was spared the disasters that erased records elsewhere. Floods, fires, earthquakes. Whether that explanation is accurate or not, it strengthens the same idea. Egypt remembers what the rest of the world forgets. Then there's the timeline. Plato places Atlantis around 9,600 years before the Common Era. That date alone shut the conversation down. No civilization existed back then. Or so we believed. But modern archaeology has complicated that picture. Permanent settlements, large ritual structures, complex social organization. This does not prove Atlantis. It does not confirm Plato's account. But it removes one automatic dismissal. It tells us the early human timeline is still being rewritten. And when timelines shift, old stories resurface. So Egypt ends up playing two roles at once. In the ancient world, it's presented as the source of the story. In the modern world, it becomes the place people search for confirmation. Not because Egypt guarantees answers, but because it carries historical weight. That weight changes how stories are read, how gaps are filled, how silence is interpreted. And that brings us to the uncomfortable middle. There is no confirmed Egyptian inscription that names Atlantis. No temple wall describing its fall. No artifact labeled with its name. That silence matters. But silence does not stop interpretation. It invites it. Especially when a culture as old as Egypt is involved. So at the end of this first stage, we're left with something very specific. Not proof. Not fantasy. But a reason the idea refuses to disappear. Egypt doesn't prove Atlantis. But it explains why Atlantis keeps getting pulled back into serious discussion. And once that door is open, the next question becomes unavoidable. Because some researchers don't just point to Egypt as a source. They point to specific locations, structures, and descriptions. And say, this looks familiar. Not confirmation. Not certainty. But claims. And that's where the debate really begins. Now that the door is open, this is where most conversations about Atlantis begin to split. Because once Egypt is accepted as part of the discussion, even cautiously, some researchers take the next step. They stop asking where the story came from. And they start asking something else. What, if anything, in Egypt actually resembles Plato's description? Not proof. Not confirmation. Just resemblance. Let's be clear about something before we go any further. Everything we're about to discuss in this stage falls into a very specific category. These are not accepted conclusions. They are not mainstream archaeological positions. They are claims made by researchers, historians, and independent scholars who believe certain locations in Egypt deserve closer attention. Some are careful. Some are speculative. Some are controversial. Our job here is not to defend them. It's to understand why they exist at all. The first location that comes up again and again is a site known as Hawara. More specifically, the structure described in antiquity as the labyrinth. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about it in detail. He claimed it was so vast, so complex, that it surpassed even the pyramids in scale. 12 great courts, thousands of chambers, endless corridors. Now here's why this matters. Plato describes Atlantis as a civilization defined not just by power, but by architecture and planning. A place of scale, organization, deliberate design. Supporters of the Atlantis-Egypt connection look at the ancient descriptions of the labyrinth and say, this doesn't sound like a temple. It sounds like an administrative center, a planned complex. Mainstream archaeology agrees the labyrinth existed. What it debates is its purpose and its condition. Much of it is now destroyed or buried, which leads to the first tension point. If a massive structure once existed and no longer does, how much can absence tell us? Underground structures and the question of what's lost. Another recurring theme is what lies beneath Egypt rather than upon it. Ancient sources repeatedly describe underground chambers, subterranean halls, and buried complexes. Some researchers argue that Egypt's visible monuments may only represent a fraction of what once existed. Not because something was hidden deliberately, but because time erases downward before upward. Floods, sediment, rebuilding. Entire layers of ancient cities can disappear beneath later ones. This does not mean Atlantis is underground, but it explains why some people keep looking there. Because Plato describes Atlantis as a civilization that vanished suddenly, not slowly abandoned, not gradually transformed, gone. And Egypt is one of the few places on Earth where civilizations were continuously rebuilt on top of older ones, which creates gaps. And gaps invite interpretation. The problem of scale. One of the strongest arguments against locating Atlantis in Egypt is scale. Plato describes Atlantis as vast, an empire, a power stretching across regions. Egypt, by contrast, is geographically fixed. It is not an island. It is not surrounded by concentric canals. Critics point this out immediately, and correctly. So why doesn't that end the discussion? Because supporters respond with a different idea. They suggest Plato's description may not refer to a single city, but to a network, a political or cultural system, centered somewhere specific, but extending beyond it. This interpretation is controversial, and it raises more questions than it answers. But again, our goal is not to accept it, only to understand why it exists. Why these comparisons keep being made. Here's the pattern that matters. People do not point to Egypt because it perfectly matches Plato's story. They point to it because it partially overlaps. Architecture, antiquity, continuity, loss. Each overlap creates a question. Each question survives because the record is incomplete, and because Egypt's timeline stretches so far back. That certainty becomes rare. What mainstream archaeology says. It's important to ground this stage. Mainstream archaeology does not identify any Egyptian site as Atlantis. There is no inscription, no map, no accepted structure, and that matters. At the same time, Archaeology openly acknowledges that large portions of ancient Egypt remain unexplored, destroyed, or inaccessible. Those two facts coexist. No confirmation, no closure, which creates space, not for belief, but for debate. The real reason this stage exists. At this point, it should be clear why this stage matters. Not because it proves anything, but because it shows how historical discussion actually works. Stories don't survive because they are true. They survive because they connect to unanswered questions. And Egypt contains more unanswered questions than almost any place on Earth. That doesn't make it Atlantis, but it explains why people keep looking. So when researchers stand in front of ruins, or buried chambers, or partially destroyed complexes, and say, "This looks familiar," they are not making a declaration. They are marking a boundary between what we know and what we don't. And once that boundary is marked, the debate doesn't end. It deepens. In the next stage, we'll move closer to the edge of that boundary, because some locations are referenced more than others, more persistently, more insistently, and understanding why those places keep returning may tell us more about Atlantis than any single answer ever could. Now we're moving closer to the edge, because once the discussion reaches this point, it stops being abstract. It stops being about ideas and interpretations alone, and it starts circling specific places, again and again, across books, documentaries, lectures, and debates. The same locations keep resurfacing, not randomly, not evenly, but persistently. And that persistence is worth examining. One of the first things to understand is this: no one points to these places because they prove Atlantis. They point to them because they refuse to disappear from the conversation. Even after criticism, even after rejection, even after decades of debate. Take Egypt's Western Desert. This region has long been described as empty, harsh, and lifeless. But ancient sources tell a different story. They describe a time when this area was green. Lakes, rivers, human settlements. Modern climate science confirms this. There were periods when North Africa looked nothing like it does today. And when landscapes change that drastically, entire civilizations can vanish from visibility. Not destroyed, not erased, just buried under time. This is why some researchers focus here. Not because Atlantis is in the desert, but because the desert itself is younger than the stories beneath it. Another location that keeps returning is the region around Lake Moeris, near the Fem. Ancient writers describe this area as heavily engineered. Controlled water levels, canals, large-scale planning. To supporters of the Atlantis-Egypt discussion, this matters because Plato's Atlantis is described as a civilization obsessed with water control. Canals, harbors, ringed waterways. The similarities are not exact, and critics are right to say that. But the overlap is just close enough to keep the question alive. Then there's the recurring focus on lost structures. Not ruins that stand tall, but structures that are mentioned repeatedly in ancient texts and barely visible today. The labyrinth, subterranean chambers, vast complexes described in detail, and then seemingly gone. This creates a specific kind of historical tension. When something is described clearly, but cannot be easily found, the debate shifts. From did this exist to what happened to it? And once that shift happens, absence becomes part of the evidence. Not proof, but pressure. Some researchers push the discussion even further. They suggest that Plato's account may compress time, that details from different eras were layered together into a single story. If that's true, then Atlantis wouldn't be a snapshot of one city. It would be a composite memory, fragments of multiple places, multiple times, multiple collapses. This idea is controversial, and it comes with serious problems. But it explains something important. Why no single site ever fits perfectly? Why every location seems almost right, and never completely wrong? This is where the discussion becomes uncomfortable. Because the closer we look, the clearer it becomes that the problem may not be geography. It may be expectation. We look for Atlantis as a place, but Plato may have been describing a pattern, a type of civilization, advanced, organized, confident, and then suddenly gone. When that pattern appears repeatedly in history, people recognize it. And recognition doesn't require proof. It requires resemblance. This is why these locations keep returning. Not because they solve the mystery, but because they sit at the boundary between what we can confirm and what we can no longer see, between archaeology and memory. And once you reach that boundary, the question changes again. It stops being, "Where was Atlantis?" and becomes, "Why does this story keep reappearing wherever civilizations collapse?" That's where we're headed next. Because the final stage of this discussion isn't about Egypt alone. It's about what Atlantis represents when history repeats itself, and why humanity keeps telling this story, even when the answers never fully arrive. If you've stayed with this story until now, then you already know the answer is not simple. Atlantis is one of the rare ideas in history that sits between categories. It isn't confirmed, but it isn't dismissed either. What we can say clearly is this: the entire story of Atlantis comes from a single source, Plato, in two specific texts. There is no Egyptian inscription that names Atlantis, no temple wall describing its fall, no artifact labeled with its name. And that matters. At the same time, modern archaeology openly acknowledges something else. Large portions of the ancient world remain unexplored. Entire regions are buried, destroyed, or inaccessible. Human history is older, more complex, and less complete than we once believed. That does not prove Atlantis, but it explains why the conversation never fully closes. Because Atlantis occupies a rare place in history. A story with no physical proof, but also no alternative explanation that fully replaces it. And that is why, after more than 2,000 years, it is still discussed, still questioned, and still searched for, not as certainty, but as possibility. So was Atlantis real? The most honest answer is this: we don't know. What we do know is why the story survives. It survives because it touches real gaps in our knowledge, because it comes from a serious historical source, and because parts of the ancient world are still missing from the record. Until those gaps are filled, if they ever are, Atlantis will remain exactly where it is now. Not proven, not forgotten, suspended between history and silence. And that is where we'll leave it. Not with a final answer, but with the clearest picture we can honestly draw. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with this exploration. This channel is dedicated to long-form historical stories. Thoughtful, careful, and grounded in evidence. If this kind of content interests you, consider subscribing. And if you have your own view on Atlantis, whether you think it was real, symbolic, or something in between, feel free to share it in the comments. For now, we'll leave the question open, and we'll continue next time.